Hello, I'm Mrs. Sparry, and welcome to this tutorial on the poem Kamikaze by Beatrice Garland, which is part of the AQA Power and Conflict Poetry Cluster. If you do have your poetry anthology with you, it'd be a great idea to have it open on the page featuring this particular poem. Before we start to look at the poem in detail, I think it's really important that we explore some of the context for this poem. Now, don't forget, context just means what has influenced the poet to actually write this poem. Where have they got their ideas from? What might have been happening at the time that they were writing, or what have they actually been doing research in, shown an interest in, that has then influenced this poem? Now, this poem's called Kamikaze. Now, I've only ever come across that term with a connection to World War II. So before studying this poem, I knew nothing about the actual part of Japanese culture that embraces kamikaze. I was very ignorant of what it actually meant. So I don't want you to not understand what this aspect of Japanese culture is about. I don't want you to see it as just being a negative thing that you may have come across before in World War II films or any other things that you've read or seen about World War II. So I'd like you to look at these two film clips first of all. The one's on YouTube, which is, as it says on the slide, talks about the actual origins of kamikaze and what it actually means. And then the second is an article that was also made into a little video that actually interviews two Japanese pilots who were chosen for special attack missions, which is what kamikaze was actually used for in terms of specifically World War II. Once you've seen those two, only then do I want you to actually read the poem. There's a link there on the slide for the BBC Bite Size section on kamikaze, but you may not need that. I just want you at this stage to think about those three questions that are on the slide. What's the poem about? Who do you think's speaking in the poem? And what do you think is the speaker's attitude to the act of kamikaze? Bearing in mind how kamikaze is actually spoken about in this poem. Now, you might think I'm trying to confuse you somewhat by all of a sudden switching to a different poem, but this is a really famous World War I poem written by Wilfred Owen, and you can see there underneath the print of the poem that this was published posthumously, which means it was published after Wilfred Owen died in 1920. Now, World War I started in 1914 and finished in 1918. Wilfred Owen himself was a serving soldier, and sadly for him, actually was killed just a week before the armistice in November 1918. None of his poems were actually published during the time of the war because some of them were seen as maybe being anti-patriotic and could have actually diminished, reduced a sense of morale back home particularly, and almost incited perhaps rebellion or revolution, and perhaps dissuaded people from volunteering and actually participating in World War I battles in trench warfare. Wilfred Owen was a volunteer himself, and he was told this idea that it is sweet and proper to die for your country. It's your duty. It's a real honour. You may remember in year 8, we actually studied a whole unit on conflict poetry, and we looked at some of the propaganda that was used by the journalists of the time, by the media at the time, known as jingoism, that really encourages people to actually be excessively patriotic, excessively proud of their country, to the point where they are willing to lay down their life, sacrifice themselves in order to see their country survive. Now, I'm not saying that that's a criticism, but for serving personnel like Wilfred Owen, for soldiers actually going through this on a daily basis, what they'd been promised by the propaganda was very different from the true grim reality of trench warfare. I really like this poem. Not only does it give you a real sense of what it could have been like to have been in this situation of trench warfare, but it also does really question that idea of, is it right that we should actually be encouraging young people, fit and able people, to actually sacrifice themselves? It's just a thought. I don't want to kind of encourage you to take up either option, but just to expand your mind and just think about it. So I'll read this out to you. Dulce et decorum est. Bent double, like old beggars under sacks. Knock-kneed, coughing like hags, we cursed through sludge, till on the haunting flares we turned our backs, and towards our distant rest began to trudge. Men marched asleep. Many had lost their boots, but limped on, bloodshod. All went lame, all blind, drunk with fatigue, deaf even to the hoots of gas shells dropping safely behind. Gas! Gas! Quick, boys! An ecstasy of fumbling, fitting the clumsy helmets just in time, but someone still was yelling out and stumbling and floundering like a man in fire or lime. Dim through the misty panes and thick green light, as under a green sea, I saw him drowning. In all my dreams, before my helpless sight, he plunges at me, guttering, choking, drowning. If in some smothering dreams you too could pace behind the wagon that we flung him in, and watch the white eyes writhing in his face, his hanging face, like a devil sick of sin. If you could hear, at every jolt, the blood come gargling from the froth-corrupted lungs, obscene as cancer, bitter as the cud of vile, incurable sores on innocent tongues, my friend, you would not tell with such high zest to children ardent for some desperate glory the old lie, Dulce et decorum est, pro patria mori. Powerful stuff. What Owen's saying here is basically the reality is very different to the promise that you gave to everybody. Just have a look at some of those poems that we covered in Year 8. Who's for the Game by Jessie Pope is a classic example of treating war as if it's a game of cricket, a game of rugby. And surely you'd want to join in on that and be part of the team. So why not be part of this team? Remember all that work we looked at on anybody who refused, whether they were a pacifist or conscientious objector, or they just plainly did not want to fight. And they were given those white feathers and treated terribly. Michael Morpurgo covers it beautifully in Private Peaceful. And he was no doubt inspired by this poem itself when he wrote about the gas attack that the two main protagonists in that poem, in that novel, Private Peaceful, when they experienced that. Have a think about this statement then. It is your duty and a real honour to die for your country. To what extent do you agree? Have a go and just write a little passage reflecting on that idea. Have a look at this YouTube clip that teaches you a little bit more about Japanese cultural history. And again, I want you to look at it with an open mind. Don't just dismiss Kamikaze. Don't just dismiss these sacrifices as being something bad, something awful. Have a think about what else do they actually mean. You know, the pride that people talked about in that Guardian film about being chosen for these special attack missions and the connection to the ancient Japanese culture of samurai. It's nothing to be mocked. It's nothing to be, to belittle. This is a great honor. There's a lot of pride at stake here. And I think once you've understood this, you'll start to look at this poem for a second time in a different light. See what you think, and have a go at that question underneath about that quotation from Kabara Ekin. Okay, so we've looked at some context, we've looked at the poem, we've looked at another poem written at a different time with it regarding a different conflict, and we've also learnt a little bit about Japanese culture. So it's now time for us to actually look at this poem in a little bit more detail and get to the technical things. Because remember, your exam is about you being able to show that you can appreciate, understand, and explain how poets use form, language, and structure to convey the overall meaning to the reader. Now, we've done this before, but I'll just go over again. Remember, forms, nothing to be afraid of. It is literally just the formation of the poem. How is it put together? Structure, again, nothing to be afraid of. It's just literally the order in which the information in the poem is presented to you. What's it like at the beginning? What's it go on to in the middle? How does it end? Language are specific patterns of language, specific words that jump out at you being particularly powerful. They provoke an emotion in you, a thought maybe, grab your attention. And this can be very personal. What I see in this might be very different to what you see in it. And that's absolutely fine. But you do need to be able to explain clearly why that particular example of language has jumped out at the page for you. And context. We know the context of this poem. We know that this poem was inspired by a historical World War II fact. But what we also appreciate is that Beatrice Garland herself was not involved in this war as a kamikaze pilot. So obviously she is writing this poem from an outsider's perspective, albeit one that's clearly well informed and well researched about this. She's also writing about a kamikaze pilot, but not from the perspective of the kamikaze pilot. And I think that's one of the trickiest things to get to grips with in this poem. One of my first questions to you when you'd read it was, who's speaking? And hopefully you've been able to work out that it's the daughter of the kamikaze pilot that's actually recalling the story of her father as a kamikaze pilot on one of these special attack missions. But because there's a mother mentioned, and then there's clearly a connection to grandchildren, it can sound very confusing. But rest assured, the person speaking in this poem is actually the daughter of a person who was given a special attack mission, was chosen to be a kamikaze pilot during World War II. But what you should have gathered is that this particular pilot, for some reason, didn't end up carrying out his mission. He turned back. And I want you to consider that in the light of everything you've learned about the feeling about these special attack missions, the feeling about the Japanese culture that inspired Kamikaze, the connection to samurai and all the pride that went into that particular aspect of Japanese culture, and what it may have felt like to be someone who was chosen for this special attack mission, but then chose themselves not to carry it out. And I think what's sad about this poem is that at the time, it sounds like he came back, which everybody should be pleased about, because had he carried out his mission, he would have died as a course of carrying out that suicide mission. And yet, nobody's happy to see him. it says, "My mother never spoke again," in line 32. My mother never spoke again in his presence, nor did she meet his eyes, and the neighbours too. They treated him as though he no longer existed. So, I guess in a way, they killed him off. They ostracized him. They refused to accept him as one of their own. And that's what really makes you feel sad when you look at those last couple of lines. And sometimes, she said, he must have wondered which had been the better way to die. Because he was metaphorically dead when he returned to his community, even though he wasn't literally dead. Because for them, the refusal to carry out the mission was worse than actually dying. It's difficult for us to grasp. Yeah, living in Britain, 21st century culture, it's hard for us to appreciate that. But it's about loyalty, it's about pride. And this is somebody who had divided loyalties. He didn't want to die. He also perhaps didn't want to kill others, which is why he turned back. But the daughter in this poem just doesn't know. She's having to speculate. Why did her father not carry out that mission? Because he never told them. And her mother never spoke to him, so she didn't know. Her daughter couldn't ask her mom. Sorry, the daughter couldn't ask the mom. There was nobody to ask. And I guess he went to his grave not telling why. So this poem is about a daughter trying to appreciate and understand why her father acted the way that she did, that he did. Let me read it to you, and we'll just go over it a little bit more to work out what do we think she's getting at. Her father embarked at sunrise with a flask of water, a samurai sword in the cockpit, a shaven head full of powerful incantations, and enough fuel for a one-way journey into history. But halfway there, she thought, recounting it later to her children, he must have looked far down at the little fishing boats, strung out like bunting, on a green-blue translucent sea, and beneath them, arcing in swathes like a huge flag, waved first one way, then the other in a figure of 8, the dark shoals of fishes, flashing silver as their bellies swivelled towards the sun, and remembered how he and his brothers, waiting on the shore, built cairns of pearl-grey pebbles to see whose withstood longest the turbulent inrush of breakers, bringing their father's boat safe, yes, grandfather's boat, safe to the shore, salt-sodden, awash with cloud-marked mackerel, black crabs, feathery prawns, the loose silver of whitebait, and once a tuna, the dark prince, muscular, dangerous. And though he came back, my mother never spoke again in his presence, nor did she meet his eyes. And the neighbours too, they treated him as though he no longer existed. Only we children still chattered and laughed, till gradually we too learnt to be silent, to live as though he had never returned, that this was no longer the father we loved. And sometimes, she said, he must have wondered which had been the better way to die. I think what strikes me first about this poem, and it's quite difficult to read out loud as a result, is the fact that there are very few stops in it. In fact, the first full stop I can see doesn't appear until line 30. Now that is an interesting thing that has got to have been done on purpose for some significance. So why? It shows a rush. It shows maybe a little bit of confusion, trying to bluster through things that you're not quite sure about. And that would fit, because the daughter doesn't know why her father decided to not go ahead and carry out his mission. What are your own thoughts? Structurally, it's fairly easy to see that this is chronological. The daughter starts to recount what she thinks might have gone through her father's mind. when he set off at sunrise and then halfway decided to turn back. And she speculates that maybe it was the beautiful images of nature and the reminder of what he was leaving behind, and even perhaps what he was about to destroy if he were to carry on with his mission. And then it ends sadly with what happened when he did come back. I get the impression that as far as the daughter's concerned, she didn't think that her father was going to actually have that kind of reception when he returned. Otherwise, why would you put yourself through that? I mean, that's what's called social suicide, isn't it? When you do something and you know it's going to cause you to lose all of your friends, all of the people who love you, completely ruin your reputation. I don't think he had any anticipation that that was going to happen, because those last two stanzas to me come as a real shock. And perhaps that's why they're written in italics as well. I've seen this poem printed lots of times and they're not always written in italics, so it's sometimes you got to be careful. It may just be a printing thing, but certainly those last two stanzas do stand out as being very different to the rest, because that's the bit that the daughter can actually comment on at first hand, because she was there. She knows that mother never spoke again. She knows that mother never met her husband's eyes again, her father's eyes. She knows that the neighbours in their community also treated him as if he was no longer a person, no longer part of their community. And she knows because she was part of the children. When it says in line 36, only we children, they were there. They saw all this happening. Whereas all the first 5 stanzas is just pure speculation. Things that she's thinking may have happened as she tries to make sense of the whole situation that must have been bizarre to have experienced as a child. Incredibly surreal. And sad. Sad more than anything else. That she could no longer see and spend time with the father we loved, as she says in line 40. And yet, those last 2 lines do sum it up. He must have wondered which had been the better way to die. Had I carried on with my mission and actually died as a result, everyone would have applauded me as being a hero, but I would have been dead. But I came back thinking I'd be able to carry on with my life as it was, and nobody wanted to know me. I was persona non grata, didn't exist, so I may as well have been dead anyway. But sadly, I now had no reputation, to the point of, you could say, that people hated him for what he'd done. As I said before, strange and unfamiliar to us, but certainly not to people at the time in living in this culture. So we have to appreciate that this is something that we may not fully understand, but at least we can start to appreciate why people felt differently in that culture at that time. I think it's worth pointing out here as well, in the first stanza, where in line 4, the poet talks about powerful incantations. I'm reminded here of that jingoism, that extreme pride that was advocated by the British media when trying to encourage people to sign up and volunteer to fight in World War I. And World War II propaganda was no different. So those powerful incantations, those kind of phrases that go through your mind, almost brainwashing, if you like, so that you're spellbound into wanting to carry out these missions, wanting to do your bit for your country. You know, you've seen them. There's loads of propaganda posters around from both World War I and World War II. And that would have been ingrained in your mind at the time. And anyone who didn't want to participate, who didn't have that same mindset, would have been treated really badly, even in British culture, in Britain of World War I and World War II time. So how are we any different, really? You've only got to think back to that white feather concept of anybody in World War One who refused to fight. They were ostracized. They were treated as no longer existing, metaphorically dead to people. So actually, it's not that much different from our own cultural history. When I say our own, I mean from Britain. I think the language to do with the description of nature is beautiful. The picture that she creates with this description of line 10, the little fishing boat strung out like bunting on a green-blue translucent sea. It's so peaceful. It's a beautiful image. Celebratory. Bunting you always associate with celebrations, festivals, fairs, that kind of thing. The flag in line 14 that's waving first one way then the other. And it makes it look like the fish are almost like a flag waving in the water as they swim in this figure of 8. Flashing silver. The flashing silver almost reminds me of the samurai sword as well, and the idea of a samurai warrior in battle. Flashing silver, swiveling, almost like creating the sound of the sword swishing through the air, perhaps. The idea in line 21 that her father is remembering how he and his brothers used to build cairns, which are those little mountains of pebbles when you try and get as high as you want, as high as you can get without it falling over. These really beautiful ideas of pastoral scenes, of fishing communities, of local communities all coming together, quality time spent with friends and family. And maybe this is where she's trying to work out, why was there such a contrast then? Why couldn't we have carried on like that? I remember us as being a really close-knit community, having lots of fun together. Why did you treat my father so badly then, when he came back? It's interesting. The tuna fish being mentioned in line 30 is one that you'll see being referenced in quite a few guidebooks or revision guides or other revision videos that you might find online. It sounds like it's an unusual fish because they only ever caught one once, and when they did, it was a real prize. They call it the Dark Prince. It's muscular, it's dangerous. Tuna fish, as far as I'm aware, aren't that particularly dangerous, but in comparison to crabs and mackerel and prawn and whitebait, much smaller, much more less likely to attack and fight back, kind of just give up immediately on being caught. The tuna would have put up a bit of a fight and would not have given in. So to catch one of these was a real prize. So maybe it's talking again about this idea that if you were chosen for a special attack mission, you were seen as a dark prince yourself, muscular and dangerous. And maybe that's how she saw her father, as something to be valued. She saw her father as a muscular prince. Dangerous, not that he was threatening to her, that he was a bad father, I don't mean that, but just dangerous as surely somebody who was valued enough to be singled out for this special attack mission. I think it's interesting because this is right before she kind of hits us with that shock of when he did come back, people treated him as if he was no longer existed. So that's where you've got structurally that volta. That's that sudden shift. We've had these beautiful descriptions of nature and this wonderful kind of community of fishing, and everybody's enjoying themselves. They all come together as a community, and then boof, line 31, there's a change. So the Dark Prince, muscular and dangerous, comes back thinking that he's still going to be heralded as a hero, and nothing. Everybody sees him as a persona non grata, as I said. Doesn't exist. They ostracize him. They have no interest in him whatsoever and treat him as though he doesn't actually live there. It's a real contrast. So we've covered form, we've covered structure, we've covered language, we've certainly covered context as well. I hope you've enjoyed this tutorial and that you look at it again in the future and listen to it again in the future. And whenever you are thinking about these poems and thinking about what makes them special, always have an idea yourself. You can take on board everything that you read, everything that you listen to, but always be brave to have your own thoughts. Remember, so long as you can actually support it with an explanation, you can support it with evidence, and you really make it clear why you think that might be an idea, that might be what the poet had in mind, that's absolutely fine. That's exactly what I've just done with you here. It's exactly what you need to do in your responses to these exam questions. Thank you very much for listening. Bye-bye.